Welcome to Digital Tunka Workshop. My name is Ben Christian. We're going to do about a 20-minute, 30-minute tutorial today, which is going to introduce you to Photoshop, ArtRage, which is the other program that I use. We're going to be creating a new document in Photoshop, tracing an existing picture of a lotus, so we don't have to particularly know any artistic skills or be able to draw particularly well. We're going to trace an existing lotus and then bring that back into Photoshop, and then in future tutorials we're going to color that image and shade it as well. So first step is to go into Photoshop. So here we are in Photoshop. I'll close that document. We need to discuss file size here. So before we can create a document, we need to look at exactly what size that needs to be, and it requires a little bit of thought. I'm going to recommend to you, unless you have your own printer or you know exactly what you're doing, to create a document based on these recommendations. So we're going to work at a file size or a document size which is known as, it's either known as Super B or A3+. And that document size is 13 inches wide and 19 inches high. What it enables you to do is to create a work which has sufficient resolution later to enlarge to a larger image, say 17 inches wide. And what it means is that you won't have spent 100 hours creating a document that's too small. You can only print it, say, A3 or letter size, A4 or letter sized. So it's important not to have spent 100 hours on a document that's too small to work with. So very important to get that right from the start. Okay, so it's 19 inches by 13, and you want, if you're working for an Epson printer, you need 360 dpi, which is the native resolution of that printer. So it could be 300, it could be 360. You just need to check. So that is paper size. What you need though to open your document in Photoshop is document size, and that's going to be smaller. The printer needs to have a border, and again, depending on what printer you output to, the border is going to be different. But a safe border is to leave, let's say, half an inch at the top and half an inch at the bottom, and half an inch on either side. So 2 half inches on either side brings you down to a document size of 12 inches by 18 at 360 dpi. Let's create that document in Photoshop, and then we'll start doing some work. So in Photoshop we come up to File, New, and here we have the dialog box for a new document. We want to come in here to inches, and width we want to have 12, height we want to have 18, resolution again 360 if you're working with an Epson printer, RGB colors fine, 8 bits is fine, white fine. This here is important, color profile Adobe RGB. Your machine may default to something like sRGB, which is for screen-based presentation. You want to use Adobe RGB 1998 for your what's called the working color space. Okay, so once that's all correct, you can select OK, and there's your new document. Part 2 of this tutorial is establishing the correct line weight. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to create a digital image that replicates a hand-painted image. And one of the first steps to achieving that goal is to establish what's called the correct line weight. So when you're drawing in Photoshop or in ArtRage, which is what we'll be doing, you need to make sure that your line is proportionately correct to the finished print size. Okay, so a hand-drawn line with a brush by a Tunka artist is approximately 0.4 to 0.6 of a millimeter wide. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that our line prints at that size. If we don't, then our line will be unnaturally thin, which to the viewer will look like it's something that a human couldn't draw, or it'll be too thick and it will look unrefined and a little bit clunky. So we need to make sure we establish a line weight that's approximately 0.5 millimetre thick. So that's easily achieved with the following method. What we'll do is we'll press Command R, and that brings up the rulers. You can also get that by going to View, Rulers. We'll double click on the rulers. We need to make sure that they are set to millimetres. In my case, they are set to millimetres. They could be points, they could be inches, but here we need millimetres. Okay, so we'll click OK, and here we are back in our document. What we need to do is now draw some guides. So let's go to View, New Guide, and this first measurement doesn't matter. It's just a nominal amount, and it's going to, let's say, we'll go 20 millimetres. So 20 millimetres in from the left-hand border, a guide will appear. Now we need to do the same process again. New guide, and this time we're going to go 20.5. Okay, so those two guides are now 0.5 millimetre apart. And what we need to do is we'll zoom all the way in. And we now need to select a brush size, which is equivalent to that. So Photoshop doesn't dimension its brushes in millimetres or inches or anything like that. It dimensions them in pixels. So we'll reduce our brush size until it's about there. We need to turn off the size variation. And so what have we got? We've got 8 pixels is about 0.5 millimetre wide. Let's go down to 7 pixels and see what that looks like. Okay, so 7's better than 8. So that means you just need to remember that when you're drawing, you need to have 7 pixels wide to approximate a 0.5 millimetre brush stroke. Okay, so we'll erase that top line, and then we'll zoom out. We leave that there because we need to refer to that line when we move into ArtRage, because ArtRage has another method of determining brush size, and that's a percentage-based size. So we'll leave that there as a reference, and then we can create a brush in ArtRage, and that will make sure that we have a consistent brush size between the two programs, ArtRage and Photoshop. So I'll clear those rulers by Command R. I'll clear the guides, which is Command something, and there we have our line. So we'll leave that, as I said, we'll leave that there. Now we've got our document size, we've got our line weight. We need to bring something into the document which we're going to use for tracing. So that'll be the next step. Okay, so here we are back in Photoshop, and it's now time to bring in our reference image. So as I said at the beginning of the tutorial, we're not talking about drawing something using a grid or from scratch. These tutorials are for anyone to be able to use. So we're just going to look at tracing an image. We're not going to do anything from first principles. We're simply going to find a nice reference image and trace that. So you can find any reference image you like. If you have a Tanka at home that you like, you can photograph that and use that as your reference image. You can search online. I think I'll do I'll do a short tutorial at some point about how to find images online. But here for today's class, I've got something already prepared, so let's take a look at that. We'll bring that into Photoshop. So we'll come across to Adobe Bridge, and here's the Lotus that I've selected, and we'll just press Enter. And what we'll do is we'll drag that down. So to do that, we can just press V, which is the Move tool, and drag the image into our document window. Okay, so next step is we need to make sure that from the very first moment we start drawing that everything's at the correct size. we want to avoid resizing our line work as much as possible. Since we're only looking at the thing that we're tracing here, we can resize this a few times before we start to lose image quality, but your line work needs to stay crisp, and there's a couple of times when you'll need to resize the line work, so you need to avoid doing that as much as you can. So first principles are to get the thing you're going to trace to the correct size before you trace it. So here we're going to pretend that we're doing a tanka that's just a basic a deity upon a lotus in a very, very simple landscape. So if that's the case, then we size the lotus so that the lotus and the deity take up the majority of our document size, which is how you'd have it if it was just a simple landscape. There would be a fairly large lotus, which I think you'd say would maybe cover about, let's say, maybe 70 to 80%. So I'm just holding down this, I'll just make sure that's proportionately right. So you do that by clicking the little chain icon, or you can hold down the shift key while you're dragging, and that constrains the aspect ratio. Okay, so I think if I was doing this picture, I'd want the lotus about that big. Again, it's up to you, it's how big you want the deity to be in the final image. So that looks good. I'll press enter. And then I'll just snap that to the center so you can see the point of the lotus there snaps to the center. The next step that we want to do, that now we've got it to the correct size, is we need to make sure there's no, let's say we're working from an image that's been photographed, there's no guarantee that it was photographed absolutely correctly. So the camera may have been at an angle to the tanka that was being photographed, or there could have been a ripple in the surface of the fabric. There could be any number of reasons why the lotus isn't actually correct in terms of symmetry or angle or position or something like that. So before we commit to tracing, we need to just check a few things and make sure that's going to be the case. So here, the first thing I'm going to check is whether the lotus is level. So to do that, I'll go back to Command R, which brings our rulers. I'll just drag a line down, a guide, sorry, and then we'll just move our lotus up. We'll just check the surface of the sun cushion, and so you can see there that that it's not quite level. So here there's a greater distance than here. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to press Command T for transform, and I'll just rotate that and make sure that everything's nice and level. Okay, that's good. The next thing I'm going to do is, I personally, this is just a personal choice, I feel like this lotus, I've traced this before, and I feel like this lotus could be a little bit deeper here in this middle section. I'd like these petals to be a little bit larger. So while I've got this in transformation mode, I'm going to go up here and we'll just gain a little more access to control of the lotus. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to distort it a little bit so that it's just a little bit deeper in that central section. And that's what I want. So I've just got a little bit more bow, a bit more curvature, a bit more grace to the size of the lotus. So that's all I need to do there. I'm going to press enter, and that's it. So that's the difference. So just made a little bit of difference. Okay. So what's next? I think looking at that, I think we're almost ready to start tracing. What I'm introducing you to today is a concept where we, for objects that have symmetry, we're going to trace half the lotus, or a little bit more than half the lotus, and what we're going to do is mirror it, and that's a very handy time-saving technique when it comes to drawing things that are symmetrical. So we'll trace from about here to about here, and then we'll flip that image, bring it together, and then our lotus will be perfectly symmetrical. With one caveat, what we need to do whenever we're working digitally, you're always fighting against the perfection of the digital method. So I have a thing called the 80% rule, which we'll look at towards the end of the tutorial. And the 80% rule means that whatever we do that creates perfection needs to be devolved by about 20%. So that way you prevent this very cold, crisp, perfect digital look, which will end up making your picture look nothing like a hand-drawn, beautiful painted tunka. So in my opinion, you should always be trying to devolve that perfection. For example, with Photoshop, you can draw an absolutely perfect gradient, and no artist in the world was ever able to draw a perfect gradient. They were measured by their ability to render a gradient, and here in Photoshop you can create one in literally 2 seconds, which is perfect, and it looks terrible. So you need to be able to, as I said, devolve that process. So even though we're doing a tracing process here, which is going to be symmetrical in the end, once we're finished, we're going to just make a little bit of variation in that so it looks like it's created by a human hand. It'll have much more beauty, much more attractive to the human eye. Okay, so here's our image. Let's bring this now into ArtRage, and we'll begin our tracing process. So to do that, we need to export it from Photoshop in something that ArtRage can open. ArtRage can open Photoshop images, but in this case I think it's because these images are large and ArtRage isn't a fantastically quick program in terms of processing things, particularly when you're working with your brush. It's better to give it less to think about than more. So we're not going to give it a Photoshop file to think about. We're just going to give it a JPEG. So that's simple. That's just a matter of going a number of ways we can do it. We can go here. We can go save as. This is the newest version of Photoshop, and you can also do a thing called save for web, which I believe Adobe are going to get rid of, but it's something that I use a lot and is very handy. So here we are, save for web. I don't know where our image is, somewhere down here. There it is. All we need to do, quality isn't especially important here. We just, 80%, whatever, that's fine. sRGB doesn't matter. JPEG is good. One thing we definitely don't want to do is reduce the size of it. Okay, so that's a pretty big file size for ArtRage to handle, but we're only doing a little bit of line work here, so we can afford to keep that up. If we were doing a lot of line work and a lot of layers in ArtRage, then probably what I'd do is I'd crop the image so we only actually have to work with the part we need to work with. But that's fine, so let's go save. Tutorials. Lotus Line 2 JPEG, that's fine. Okay, that's saved. Let's come across to ArtRage. ArtRage is already open, don't care about that. We'll just get it up to fill the screen. It's, by default it has a document come up here. We don't care about that. We're just going to go File. Here we want to have Import Image File. Go to Tutorials, and we have, what did we call it? Lotus Line 2. And there it is. So why are we in ArtRage? The reason I use ArtRage because I haven't, obviously used a lot of different programs, but ArtRage to me is the best pen tool available. There's a reason we're not tracing this in Photoshop, and it's because ArtRage has this thing called the pen tool, which has this thing called smoothing, which makes you draw like a guru. So it's very, very hard to draw a good line on a computer, particularly if you have like an old Wacom tablet. I have a Cintiq, so I'm drawing directly on the screen, but if you're drawing down on the desk and looking at a screen, or even worse, if you're drawing with a mouse, very, very hard to do. But with smoothing, you can get your line looking very, very good. Another way you can get very, very accurate or very precise, or I don't know whether precise is the word, but very perfect lines is you can use the pen tool in Photoshop, but that's a total saga in my opinion, and I would never do that. That's like a vector-based drawing process. So let's have a look now. So we'll zoom in. very first thing we want to do is we need to create a new layer. So the worst thing you can do is forget to do that, and you end up drawing on a non-transparent layer, and then you wasted all of your time. You have to go back and get it on a transparent layer, because what you want to bring is just a line only into Photoshop. So we've got a new layer. We can name it if we want. I'm not going to. This is a reasonably quick process. Next, we need to establish our brush weight. So here's our golden line, which is there. That's the thing we need to look at. So we'll zoom in on that. Here, the tool we're looking for is called the ink pen. And what have we got here? As I said, ArtRage measures things in percent, which is kind of an unusual way of doing it. So I've got 8% set. Let's see what 8% does. 8% is kind of close, but it's still too thick. So let's come down. We can use the square bracket key, the same as Photoshop. Let's come down to 5 and see, or 6. Let's see what that does. So 6 is too thin. Let's go to 7. Yeah, it's okay. So 7's good. So in Photoshop, 8 pixels. In ArtRage, 7%. But they're not set numbers, right? So it depends on the resolution of your picture. So it's like, don't start thinking that that's the only time you have to think about that. Every time you do a picture, if you're doing a book cover, which is very small, and that percentage needs to be different. If you're doing a very, very large chunk, then that percentage is going to need to be different. So each time you change file size, it's going to have to be different. But for that Super B size, or A3 Plus, they're your magic numbers, 7 and 8. 7% ArtRage, 8 pixels in Photoshop. Okay, so we've got our new layer. Let's start tracing. So the first thing to do is, you may want to choose a colour which is, has a little bit of contrast to your background, so that when you're drawing, you can sort of see what you're doing. So red's fine, whatever, depends on the picture. The next step is to adjust our smoothing and get that correct. So the smoothing is something you'll need to adjust from time to time, depending on what you're working on. So if I turn the smoothing up and try and draw a tight line, say I'm tracing that little bit there, then that's what happens, and you don't have any control much. So if I wanted to follow the artist's line here, so I lose that completely. So that's too much smoothing for a line like that, but for here, it's kind of okay. If I'm doing something tight like this, then the smoothing needs to come way down, and that will retain the shape. Okay. So get rid of all of that. And we'll start tracing. As I said, we're going to trace from here over to here. And we're going to ignore this side because we're going to mirror it. So I'll just do a little bit of tracing. I won't do the whole thing. You'll get the hang of it once I show you. We worked out that, let's try whatever, 60% will be fine. The more you're zoomed in, the easier it's going to be to throw your line. In addition to that, when you work, if you rotate your image, which is something that's available in the newer versions of Photoshop and it's available in ArtRage, get your where you want to draw your line into a comfortable position, because you can't draw comfortably in all positions. Make sure you're continually rotating, continually zooming in and out, and then you'll be able to work nice and efficiently, and you'll make sure that you can, when you're drawing for hours at a time, it's not too difficult for you. Okay, so let's draw a few lines, and then I'll leave you with it. Okay, so that line was hard for me because I need to rotate that. I'm left-handed, so that's kind of drawing upwards for me. Now you may choose, let's say, this line here. You may choose, that may not come to a point, so you may want to do something like this. So you want to exaggerate a point without bringing your paintbrush off, or your pen tool off. And then the smoothing will kind of take care of that. So that's too much smoothing in that case, so let's take a look at that. You get the hang of this, so you need to exaggerate the point, right, to counteract the smoothing. Okay, so that's cool, so that's kind of right. We don't have to exactly copy what the artist's done here. The reason I chose this lotus is because it's a very unusual lotus. It has this, I've not seen this stylization of the lower petal before, where it comes to a point here. In my experience, that's kind of unique. So this is a wonderful example of a lotus. With the smoothing option, you need to, we'll fix this later in Photoshop if it's wrong, but you need to make sure your lines are always meeting. The smoothing will tend to truncate or shorten just the very end of the line. You can end up with little gaps here, and you end up with what's called a hesitant line, and that looks like the artist has no confidence. That's something you need to try and compensate for with this smoothing option. This stylization here I don't particularly like, so I'm just going to do something like this. I'm going to exaggerate to that point, and I don't like that either, so I'll turn up the smoothing. Yeah, and that's kind of what I want there. Okay. Now, the only other thing to, like I said, this is very straightforward. The only other thing to consider here is this gold line here. So we need to come down from our 7%. Let's come down to, say, 4. And if you choose to include this, you may want to do it on another layer. May be beneficial later. That's not too bad. So drawing parallel lines is something that's quite hard. Particularly with the smoothing option. Okay, that's cool. So here we are. If I turn off our background layer, you can see that's our lotus. That's as much as I'm going to do, because you don't need to see any more, and the tutorial will go for too long otherwise. The only other thing to check is make sure when we're doing our mirroring, you need to draw far enough into this right hand side of the lotus so that when we flip it, we have some options to choose for with lines. So that doesn't make a lot of sense, but when we come into Photoshop later, you'll see what I mean. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw a little bit further here. Okay, I need to select the right line weight, which is back up to 7. Exaggerate there. Yep, beautiful. In these areas where there's foliage hiding, you need to obviously work out where the artist intended the line to go. There's a couple of ways you can do that. You can, just use your own artistic eye to do it, or in examples like this, you just need to check on the other side what's going on. So in the areas where there's some obstruction, if you check, diametrically across from that object, you can see where the line was meant to go, perhaps. In this image, we're going to want to also, we're not just doing the lotus petals, we're going to draw the what is called the pericarp, or the seed pod of the lotus, and then in this case we've got a sun cushion. So the sun cushion we're going to do in Photoshop. I'll show you that later, but we need to include the pericarp. So I'll just continue drawing along here. I'll just show you that.